All right, well, welcome everyone. Welcome to our last Life Science Lecture Series with Dr. Nikki Grant-Hoffman. My name is Sarah Brooker and I'm the Program Coordinator with Colorado Canyons Association. If you're not familiar with CCA, we're a local nonprofit and our mission is to foster community stewardship, education, and awareness of our 3 national conservation areas here on the Western Slope. Those are McInnis Canyons, Dominguez Escalante, and Gunnison Gorge, NCA. 2020 is a pretty special year for McInnis Canyons. This Saturday, actually, the 24th, is its 20th anniversary. So in 2000, 20 years ago, Congress officially designated McInnis Canyons as a national conservation area and permanently protected the landscape, protecting all of its significant resources. So we want to celebrate the 20th anniversary with you, and we've been hosting several events over the past couple of months to bring more awareness to McInnis Canyons and its significant resources. So we're here tonight with Dr. Nikki Grant-Hoffman. This is our last lecture of our Life Science Lecture Series. Nikki is the BLM ecologist here at the Grand Junction Field Office, and her focus is specifically on the national conservation areas. And she's here with us tonight to talk about her fire restoration methods in McInnis Canyons and what she's been doing in response to the recent wildfires. So we'll leave about 10 minutes at the end of this webinar to answer any questions you have. If you have any questions during the webinar, you can enter them into the chat box or the question and answer box at the bottom of your screen. So without further ado, I'll give it over to Nikki. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, thanks, Sarah, for inviting me to give this talk, and thanks everyone for taking some time out of your evening to listen to a little bit of what we've been working on, and thanks to CCA for all that they do for the conservation areas and for putting on this lecture series. So I'll just go ahead and get started. Today I'm going to be talking about restoration after fire, kind of in Western Colorado. As Sarah said, I'm an ecologist and science coordinator. I work out of the Grand Junction Field Office. I specifically work with McInnis Canyons and Dominguez Escalante National Conservation Areas. And this is kind of a series of projects and some work we've had ongoing for several years. And there's several other folks in the Grand Junction office that I've worked with, Anna Lincoln, Heidi Plank, and Jim Dollarshell, but also other folks in the office, help with this kind of work. Pretty much anything we do is really a team effort. So if we're going to talk about restoration after fire, something that we definitely have to talk about is seeding. And that is kind of just what it sounds like. It's putting out seed after a fire to try and encourage vegetation growth. And part of the reason that we do seeding is that it's pretty cost effective. When you look at more intensive kind of on the ground things, seeding is pretty cost effective compared to those. You can also cover large areas with it. So when we're talking about public lands, generally we're talking about thousands to tens of thousands to even hundreds of thousands of acres. And when you're trying to do treatments across that large of a scale, seeding is something that you can do versus more intensive things can be harder to do. I also want to talk a little bit about native seed versus non-native seed. So this talk, I'm really going to focus on native seeds. So those are seeds that are native to our area, native plant species. There are times when managers might seed with non-native seeds. There's different reasons for that. Historically, we did more of that. These days, we tend to use more native seed. But in areas that are highly degraded, there might still be a use for non-native seed. But in this talk, I'm really just going to talk about the native seeding efforts. Within the conservation areas, we really try and only use native seed. I'm also going to talk about the different types of things that we seed with. So when we talk about seeding vegetation, in our area, we're often talking about grasses, forbs, which are flowering plants, and shrubs. We don't tend to do a lot of seeding of trees in our area, partly because they tend to come back reasonably well, and also because we don't have a lot of trees. We deal a lot more in shrublands. And so, I've talked about all the wonderful things about seeding, but seeding can also fail. So it's something that we're still. So the picture that you're looking at here is the Pine Ridge Fire, which burned just kind of behind the Book Cliffs in 2012. And the airplane going over and kind of the stuff coming out of the tail of that airplane, that's seeding. So that's a bunch of seed being dropped on that fire after the fire. So in 2012, we had a pretty big fire year. We had 2 fires within the conservation area, within McInnis Canyons Conservation Area, and then we also had the Pine Ridge Fire within the field office. And when we were kind of looking at how to restore those areas, we realized there were things that we didn't know and that we weren't sure about. So we decided to kind of undertake a learning exercise, doing some research on what had worked in the past on different fires that we had so that we could move forward better with our restoration efforts. So the next few slides, I'm going to talk about some more that was kind of related to that. The picture that you're looking at here is the Knowles Fire, which burned along the Colorado River and McInnis Canyons in 2007. This work, if you're interested, can be found in Natural Areas Journal. So as I said, in 2012, we kind of started this undertaking because we had a pretty active fire year and wanted to improve our restoration. So we looked at our fires that burned in 2012, which I think you guys can see my pointer on the screen here, our Pine Ridge to the left of your screen. And then on the right, we had the Wrigley and Long Mesa fires that burned in 2012 as well. And that was within the wilderness area in McInnis Canyons National Conservation Area. And then we also looked at the Knowles Canyon and Meade Canyon fires, which burned earlier, and the Cosgrove fire, which also burned earlier. So the picture here, this is the smoke plume. So this is taken from the parking lot of the BLM office. And this is the Pine Ridge smoke plume when that was burning behind the book cliffs there. So the fires we looked at, we kind of looked at a time series. So we looked at the Meade Canyon fire, which burned in 2005, Knowles, which burned in 2007, Cosgrove, which burned in 2011, and then Pine Ridge, Wrigley, and Long Mesa all burned in the summer of 2012. So what we wanted to look at was vegetation. When we're talking about restoration, there are many things that go into restoration, but a lot of it has to do with the vegetation, because obviously that's the thing that you're losing when something burns. And so we wanted to take vegetation data from these areas that had burned at least 3 years post-burn. So after the area had had some chance to recover, we wanted to look and see what that looked like. And we also compared that to areas that had not burned. The picture that you're looking at here is Pine Ridge as it was burning in 2012. So what did we find and kind of what did we do? So just to give you an idea of what we did, the picture that you're looking at here is the Wrigley fire. So that's in the wilderness area in McInnis Canyons. And this is in 2015. So you can see after 3 years, there is some vegetation recovery. We use these frames to kind of measure all of the vegetation that we could. So we identified, all of the grasses, all of the flowering plants, all of the shrubs, and kind of got an idea of how much of everything there was. And we did that across those 6 fires. So what did we find? We took all of those numbers that we had taken, all of those numbers of the amount of different plants and plant species that we had, and used a mathematical model and kind of told us, show us the patterns, how do we categorize these things? And so what we found is that we could look at unburned and burned areas. And one thing that really defined our unburned areas was native trees. And that's an obvious one, right? Trees burn really well, and it's something that takes a long time to recover. So 3 to 10 years post-fire, you're still not gonna see the same amount of trees that you would in an unburned area. So that one was pretty straightforward. We also saw biological soil crusts and native shrubs, and I'm gonna talk a little bit more about those. So biological soil crusts, if you're not familiar with that, if you've been, in areas around Moab and areas around here, you'll see that the soil often looks really bumpy, it's dark, and that's because there are living organisms in the soil. This is a really important component of our systems out here in the arid West, and through most desert lands, this is a really important component. So these are living organisms, things like mosses, lichens, cyanobacteria that actually live on and in the soil in these areas where we don't have 100% cover of vegetation. So these will actually be in the interspaces between plants. So with biological soil crusts, there are 2 ways we lose those in fires. One is if it's a very hot fire and it burns near the ground very hot, then that can actually burn the soil crust and burn the soil, and you can lose it that way. Another way that we lose soil crust is after the fire. Even if the ground itself didn't burn hot enough to burn the soil crust, then once that soil crust is really exposed, then we can lose it through wind and water action kind of after the fire. So the photo that you're seeing in the top left here is some biological soil crust that was still intact after the Wrigley fire. But over the next several months, that biological soil crust will kind of die off as wind and water and as it's more exposed. In the bottom right, you'll see kind of an intact area that didn't burn near the Wrigley fire, and you'll see how that soil crust is just kind of interspersed with the different plants. So, apologize, the title's a little bit off here. The next thing I wanted to talk about was native shrubs. And if you remember in that graph, it kind of sat right in the middle of burned and unburned. It didn't necessarily define burned areas or unburned areas. And part of that's because we really kind of took things that were different and lumped them together. So when we talk about native shrubs, there's more to the story. So native shrubs don't always respond one way to a fire. And a good example of this is a comparison between oak brush and sagebrush. So oak brush, also known as gamble oak, Quercus gambellii, is a really good resprouter. So what you're looking at here is a picture of the Long Mesa fire. So that's in McInnis Canyon's wilderness. And this is 5 years after the fire. And you'll see where these red arrows are. That's actually oak brush that has come back after the fire. So this is a shrub that tends to do really well after fire. Kind of as another anecdote, we had a fire this summer known as the Hunter Fire. It was a small fire. It burned in an oak brush area, and maybe 3 to 4 weeks after the fire, the oak brush was already resprouting. So this is a shrub that does really well after fire. If you compare that to sagebrush, sagebrush is a shrub that does not do well after fire. And part of that is because it's a reseeder. So versus oak brush, which can come up from the roots if it's not burned too hot, sagebrush needs to come up from seed. Once you kind of remove that crown of the sagebrush, it doesn't do well coming up from the roots. It really needs to recruit from seed. So what you're looking at here is a picture of an area known as Fish Park, which is just outside of McInnis Canyon's National Conservation Area. This is an area that burned in the Wrigley Fire Complex, which burned parts of McInnis Canyons in 1999, and then it burned again in the Spring Fire in 2006. So on the top left, this is pre-fire in 1988, and the bottom right, that's about 10 years after the fire. And as you can see, that sagebrush is still not back. So that sagebrush doesn't come back very well after fire. So we talked about our native trees, we talked about our biological soil crust, and we talked about our shrubs. Those are things that can define our unburned areas. When we look at our burned areas, the things that define those, one of them is species that we seeded, which is great. That means that when we're seeding, we are actually doing something, we can see those species as that area is recovering. And then also, this is a little bit jumbled, but one of the things in here is native forbs, and that's our flowering plants. That's going to be species that are often annual, so that means they complete their life cycle in 1 year. And often these are things that tend to come up after disturbance, might tend to come up after fire. So let's start by talking about our seeded species. So we can pick up that we have seeded species after we burn an area and we put down seed. So that's great. That shows us that what we're doing as a management action is having some effect. But when we really dig into the data, again, kind of like the shrubs, where not all shrubs are equal, not all seeds are equal. So we were able to look at those different fires and kind of quantify what seeds are really good seeders, what are things that we find where we seeded them, and what seeds are not as effective. We put them out a lot, but we don't tend to see them a lot after fires. So what you're looking at here in the table is the light gray. The species that are in light gray are what we call our good reseeders. So these are things that we tend to have in seed mixes, and we find them where we seed them. So it seems like they're really doing a good job of coming up when we seed them. These are things like yarrow, Indian ricegrass, four-winged saltbush, Lewis's flax, and sand drop seed. The species in the dark gray are what we call good recolonizers. So these are species that we find after fire, but not where we seeded them. So these are things that tend to do well after fire, but don't necessarily do well from seed when we as managers put them out. So these are things like bottlebrush squirreltail, needleland threadgrass, and sandberg's bluegrass. And then we had one species, western wheatgrass, that did great everywhere. It did great when we seeded it. It did great when we didn't seed it. And then we had a few species in white here that we just didn't have enough data to tell one way or the other. So we're able to look at our data and really kind of evaluate some of the species that we put out and decide which ones are really useful and worth continuing to put in our seed mixes and which ones maybe not. The other thing I wanted to talk about was that native forbs piece. So this is these flowering plants. And I wanted specifically to talk about called the natural response after fire. So certainly, there have been fires, forever, long before managers were out seeding them or trying to restore after them. And so, nature does have a response after fire. There are species that will come up after fire. Some of that has been altered because of invasive species and climate change and things like that. But, there is still a natural response. And this native forbs piece can kind of be a proxy to show us what's happening there. So to really get at that and look at that piece of restoration after fire, we did some intensive vegetation monitoring only on the Pine Ridge Fire for 5 years after the fire. And this work can be found in Native Plants Journal. Oh, so let me go back here. Sorry, the picture you're looking at here is the Pine Ridge Fire in 2012. And then for the next few slides, I'm just going to take you through a series of photos, kind of showing you how the fire has changed. I really enjoyed being out on this fire for 5 years and seeing how it changed over time, and I think it can be really instructive. So I'm just going to take you guys on a little photographic journey here. So here is one of our points on the Pine Ridge Fire in August in 2012. This is about a month after it burned. Here is that same site the next summer, so about a year later in 2013. Here's that site in 2014, so again a year later. And then here's the site in 2015. So what we really wanted to get at with this is trying to get an idea of what's the natural response versus what's the response from our management action. So what's the response from those seeded species, and how do those two things work together? So remember I talked about native forbs, those flowering plants. That's kind of the proxy that we're using in this, this bit. And the reason we're using that is so in our seed mix, we had 2 species of native forbs that were in our seed mix. So we only had the opportunity for 2 species to come up from native forbs. However, we found almost 30 species of native forbs that came up after the fire. So there was a really big natural response. There's a lot of stuff that was still there even after the fire. You know, and if you remember back to that first picture, it really looks like a beach. It looks pretty desolate, but there are a lot of seeds still in that soil and that are still coming in from the edges that are able to grow and establish after the fire. So what we kind of learned from this work is that seeding is really a balancing act. So you want to supplement a seed bank that you may have lost. So a seed bank are the seeds that basically are left on the site. If you have a fire that burned really hot and burned the soil really hot, you may have lost some of that seed bank, or that seed bank might be compromised. Similarly, if you had, say, a big rain event just after a fire, then you may have washed some of that seed bank away. If you have a really large fire, so you don't have a lot of plants around the edge to kind of provide seeds to that area, that's another reason you might have a compromised seed bank. So as managers, we kind of have to look at that and gauge how intact is that seed bank. And then once you kind of got an idea of that, you want to think of your seeding in terms of how do I supplement that natural response without suppressing it. So if we as managers put out really aggressive species that come up really well, then we can actually dampen or kind of hurt that natural response that's happening. So we have to think of how do we complement it and not compete with that. So it's really a balancing act, and it has a lot to do with what vegetation was there before. You know, did we have some of those good recolonizers that we talked about earlier on the site beforehand? Do we think that some of those might come back? Or are we dealing with an area that has species that don't tend to respond really well to fire, in which case we might want to be a little bit more aggressive with our seed. So I'm going to get back to sagebrush now. We were talking about shrubs, and we talked about how oak brush does really well, and sagebrush does not. So just these are the same pictures you saw before, where we can see the pre-fire sagebrush and how much was present in the area, and then kind of the post-fire. And this is 10 years post-fire, 10 to 15. So this has been quite a while, and we're still not seeing that sagebrush coming back. So the work that I'm getting into now will be published in Journal of Rangeland Ecology and Management in the next issue or 2. So why sagebrush specifically? So sagebrush is really common in our area, and it's also really important for several reasons. One, just because it's a native plant, it provides forage for lots of different species, it provides habitat for species, and one of those species is the Gunnison sage-grouse. So Gunnison sage-grouse is a bird that was listed as threatened by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in November 2014. So it's a species that kind of has a special focus. So with that, we had an area just outside of McInnis Canyons that burned in the Wrigley complex of fires, which burned part of McInnis Canyons National Conservation Area as well. So that burned in 1999. There was also a second fire that came through this area in 2006. And this is an area that Gunnison sage-grouse were known to use. So this was an area where they were breeding before the fires. After the fires, you know, if you remember from that picture, the sagebrush did not return. The sage-grouse really need sagebrush for their nesting and breeding, and so our restoration was not successful, at least not from a sage-grouse perspective. This is an area that's no longer considered habitat for that threatened species. So with that, we identified this as an area that was a high priority area where we might try some more intensive management actions. So if you remember back at the beginning, I talked about how seeding is a great tool as managers that we can use over a lot of acres. But there are times when we might do something more intensive, more expensive, if there's an area that kind of fits certain criteria and is a higher priority for some reason. And this is an area that fell into that category, where we wanted to look at something different besides just seeding. One, because the seeding hadn't been super effective, and also because it was such a high priority. So in order to think about this, the first thing we had to think about is, well, why doesn't sagebrush regenerate after fire? You know, we looked at oak brush and that does really well. So what's different about sagebrush that it's not coming back really well after fire? And part of that has to do with the fact that it needs to come up from seed. And there's several things that can limit that. So we wanted to look at the different factors or the different things that could be limiting that sagebrush regeneration. And we wanted to look at factors that we could do something about as management. So one of the biggest things is precipitation, right? If we don't get the right rain at the right time, then that probably has a lot to do with why our sagebrush isn't recruiting. However, as managers, there's not a whole lot we can do about that. So we really wanted to look at things that we could do something about. So with that, we came up with competition with other plants. Since sagebrush is coming up from seed and not resprouting, it has to compete with everything else that's trying to come up from seed. So we thought that that could be something that's limiting. Water, you know, while we can't do anything about the precipitation, about the rain or the snow that's coming into the area, we can look at some ways to kind of manipulate soil moisture, or, you know, kind of add some extra moisture to some seeding areas. Also herbivory, and specifically here we're talking about deer and elk. So this is an area that's winter habitat for deer and elk. In the winter they do a lot of browsing on shrubs. So perhaps that was something that was limiting the sagebrush coming back in this area. And then we also wanted to look at seeds versus seedlings. So, you know, I've been talking about seeds this whole time. They're less expensive, they're easier to put out. But from previous work, we had tried sagebrush from seed and just hadn't gotten a lot of success with that. So even though it's more intensive, more expensive, we thought it was worth looking at that seedling piece. So we came up with several different treatments to look at those different factors that we talked about. I'm not going to go through all of them because there were quite a few, but just to give you an idea, we looked at things like in this top left, you can see these little cartons. This is like a polymer gel that would release moisture over 90 days. So it's kind of a way to water the seedlings. We also looked at caging the seedlings to try and keep the deer and elk from eating them. We looked at adding these wooden structures that we called microsites that would just kind of provide a little bit of protection and kind of hold some soil moisture in. So we kind of went through a whole suite of different treatments. So what did we find out? What treatments mattered? The picture that you're looking at here, another treatment that we did to look at competition with plants was we treated areas with herbicides. So if you can tell, right in the middle of the picture, there's kind of a lighter square. So that's where we sprayed some herbicide to try and kind of knock back the competition with other plants. And then we also looked at mechanical removal, where we actually took hand tools out and physically removed vegetation. So the first treatment that I want to talk about is the seed versus seedling piece. So in order for a plant to get from a seed to a seedling, there's a whole number of hurdles that it needs to get past. So I thought we wanted to kind of look at, you know, how effective is using a seedling versus seed. You know, certainly a seedling is going to be a lot more labor intensive and a lot more expensive than a seed, but is it worth it? And what we found, so what you're looking at in the table here is you'll see the years, so kind of time on the left-hand side, 2017 through 2019. The treatment area, so we had 5 different areas where we tried all of these different experiments, so that's just kind of showing you that. And then we're looking at our percent survival. So what you'll see is when we're looking at our seeds, we had very few sagebrush that came up from seed. And of those sagebrush that did come up, by 2019, we had no survival. So we had no seedlings that established from seed. If you compare that to our seedlings, we actually had pretty good survival. So, you know, in 2017, we're ranging from about 40% up to 90% survival. And then even towards the end of our study in 2019, we still have 81% survival in one of our treatment areas. We do. But, you know, overall, we're still getting pretty good survival of our seedlings. We also found that extra water did not improve the growth or survival of our seedlings. So we knew that water, we live in a dry area. We don't have a lot of precipitation. If these seedlings don't get the right amount of water at the right time, it can be really difficult for them to get through, say, a dry spring, a dry summer, or a dry fall. And so we thought if we could provide them extra water, that's going to be really big. And it didn't really pan out that way. So we spent kind of a lot of effort bringing in these dry water containers that were a way to actually kind of water our seedlings. But what we found was that when we just stacked some wood on one side of it to kind of provide it some protection and kind of hold in some of that soil moisture, that worked just as well. So it's certainly a much easier way for us to provide some extra moisture for those seedlings. And we found out that it wasn't really worth all the effort to try and bring in that external water source. If we could just keep a little bit of water right there with the seedling, with our wood structures, that made just as much difference in terms of growth and survival as that extra water did. So we also found that areas treated with herbicide generally had more growth. So what you're looking at here is a graph on the y-axis, so that kind of vertical axis, we're looking at growth, and that's growth of our sagebrush seedlings. So if you think of like the volume of the seedling, that's what we're measuring. Across the bottom, you're seeing those 5 treatment areas that I talked about. We had 5 different areas where we put out all of our treatments. The herb stands for the herbicide, so the places where we sprayed some herbicide to try and knock back those plants. And then the mech stands for mechanical, so that's where we went and actually cleared a small area of vegetation from vegetation and then put the seedling right in the middle of that. And what we found was in areas that we treated with herbicide, we had better growth than in areas where we removed the vegetation. The next thing I'm going to talk about is our caged seedlings. So we found that when we caged our seedlings, we had better survival than when our seedlings were not caged. So again, what you're looking at here on that vertical axis is % survival. So versus growth, we're looking at just survival of the seedlings. And then across the bottom is our treatment areas again. And then we're looking at time here. So the blue is 2017, the green is 2018, and the orange is 2019. So it's kind of time as you go to the right. And what you'll see is the solid bars, which are the caged seedlings, are generally higher than the barred bars. So it's showing you that in those areas where we cage seedlings, we had better survival. So what does that mean when we take it all together? What it really means is 2 things. From that beginning, seedlings are really worth the effort, even though it takes a lot more time and effort to grow out a seedling, to plant a seedling, than to just kind of put some seeds out on snow. We don't really see a lot of survival from seed, and we do from seedling. So in those really high priority areas, it's worth it for us in our area to try and do sagebrush from seedlings. The other thing we found was that taken as a whole, our data really showed that the seedlings just need to be protected. So we didn't really see a lot of sign of herbivory on those seedlings while we were doing our study. So the cages, we don't think really kept deer and elk from eating them. What it probably did was just provide those seedlings a little bit of protection. Kind of same thing with that microsite, with that kind of wood structure we had on the side. It just kind of provides them a little bit of protection. And that's protection from the wind, protection from the sun, keeps a little bit more moisture in that area, and just kind of gives them the little boost they need to kind of grow up. So we learned a lot about how to plant sagebrush in our area and how to be successful with that. But our real goal was to create habitat, right? We didn't just want to plant sagebrush. We're trying to create habitat here. So how do we do that? The idea that we had with this, and this was kind of going on concurrently as the other stuff that I was just talking about, was that we wanted to try and create these kind of fertile islands. So similar to the way, we found that seedlings really just need a little bit of protection. That's true for a lot of different species. So we thought if we could get this sagebrush established in these little islands, then those could kind of be little areas where other plants could get established, other sagebrush could get established. The other thing about those is they would provide seed. Since sagebrush is a plant that comes up from seed, it doesn't resprout from the roots, you need a source for that seed. And if you burn a lot of acres and you burn all of your sagebrush, then you no longer have that seed source. So he thought by establishing these islands, then you would have a seed source so that when the conditions are just right, you would have the seeds there ready to germinate, and hopefully, you would see recruitment from these islands. And so the picture that you're looking at here is one of these islands out in the Fish Park area, and this is a picture from 2017. So what we did in this part was we had about 500 that we planted at 5 different locations in Fish Park in 2016. This was before we'd done all of our research on how to plant sagebrush, so we planted them the best way that we knew how, the way that we thought would give them the best chance of survival. And that was planting them with 2 of those dry water quarts that I talked about that kind of provide a little bit of extra moisture, provide some water. And then we actually did a rewatering the next summer, again, trying to get those to get established. We put weed cloth around each seedling. We caged each seedling. We did not put any other seed in these areas, and we did not use any herbicide in these areas. Kind of serendipitously, at the same time as we were doing this, there was a fire in McInnis Canyon's National Conservation Area known as the Dog Island Fires. That's a fire that burned in 2015. And after that fire, we noticed that there was a natural sagebrush recruitment event happening. So that part worked out really well because we could kind of study a natural population and look at what kind of survival was happening in that population, and then kind of compare it to our artificial population where we come in and planted seedlings. So on Dog Island, we looked at survival of seedlings in that natural regeneration event from 2016 to 2019. So what we're looking at here is another graph on your y-axis, so that vertical axis, you're looking at % survival of our sagebrush. So, you know, at the top, we're starting with 100% survival. They were all alive when we planted them, and then kind of looking at their survival from there. You're looking at time across the bottom, and I apologize, there's an error. That May 17 should be May 18, that second May 17. So this is over time. And then you're looking at those 5 different islands that we planted, and then the black line in the middle is your average. So kind of the takeaway from this is, you know, that first time step. So when we first plant them, we kind of lost a lot of seedlings. But after that, our survival really evened out. So the sagebrush that made it through that kind of first initial shock of being planted and, you know, set free to the wild, were able to survive pretty well after that. Our overall survival was about 40% of our seedlings that we planted, and the overall survival in the Dog Island population was about 46%. So we were able to approximate kind of a natural survival of sagebrush seedlings. Another way to look at this data, so that was kind of giving you the overall survival. You can also look at survival from step to step, which is in some ways a little bit more informative. So, you know, we know that we've lost some of those seedlings, but of the seedlings that we have, are we able to keep them? So when we look at the data that way, we'll see that we really, after that initial drop, we really have pretty good survivals, even reaching 100% survival at some of our time steps. And the average of that is just over 80%. So after that initial die-off of seedlings, after we first planted them, we're reaching about an 80% survival from there, which is great. Just to kind of show you on the bottom here, you know, when we look at this, you know, we talk about precipitation in our area is really dry. If we had done this study over a series of really wet, you know, great weather years, then it would be harder to tell how effective we've really been as managers. But you can see the red arrows here are showing you when we took our data, and all of those except for the last are at lower than average precipitation. So even with lower than average precipitation, we were still able to get pretty good survival with our sagebrush seedlings. So this is an area of ongoing research. We'll see how these islands kind of continue to hang on, if we start to see any recruitment from those, if we start to see other plants kind of popping up where we've planted those sagebrush islands. This summer, we will be able to put all of our hard-learned lessons into action. So we had the Seedling fire, which burned just this past summer, just a few months ago. And we were able to get some funding. This is an area that burned in sage-grouse habitat, and we were able to get some funding to plant sagebrush seedlings. So we will kind of be taking all of our lessons learned from all of that and trying to recreate that with a fire that's just burned, and saying if we can't kind of jumpstart that sagebrush recruitment kind of right after the fire. So what are our takeaways? We're learning a lot about how to seed after fires, and specifically where to seed, where not to seed, and what to seed. As we're seeing bigger fires, this is increasingly important. So in 2012, the Pine Ridge Fire was the largest fire we'd seen in the Grand Junction field office at about 12,000 acres, closer to 13,000 acres. The Pine Gulch Fire, which just burned this past summer, was over 130,000 acres. So when you're looking at seeding over that amount of area, you really have to be selective. You're not going to have, you know, the time or the resources or even the seed to seed, you know, hundreds of thousands of acres. So we have to be a little bit smarter. That. We're also learning how to improve sagebrush recovery. So sagebrush is something that's very important in our area. It's something that does not do well after fire. And we're kind of figuring out how we might be able to jumpstart that regeneration in our really high priority areas. We'll also continue doing research on kind of our fertile island concept to see if that pans out. You know, we feel pretty confident that we found a way to establish sagebrush, but kind of what that sagebrush does into the future is something that we're still looking at. So with that, I'll say thanks to the folks who've helped. We've done a lot of this work with help from the Upper Colorado Environmental Plant Center in Meeker. They've done a lot of our sagebrush seedling grow outs, sagebrush seed collection. Also, Western Colorado Conservation Corps has helped us with a lot of the planting of seedlings. It takes a lot to plant 500 seedlings. The Grand Junction and McInnis Canyon staff, of course, has been super helpful. I'd like to thank Colorado Canyons Association for helping put on this talk, and they're also helping us with the Seaber Canyon effort with getting some sagebrush seedling out there. And then Colorado State University is helping us continue some of the fertile island research. So with that, that's the end of my talk. I don't know if there are questions out there, and thanks for taking the time to listen.
All right, thank you, Nikki. That was very interesting, and I know I learned a lot. So yeah, now it would be a great time for questions. If you have any, you can enter them into the chat box or the question and answers box. While folks think of those, Nikki did mention the Seaber Fire project and the current stuff we're doing on that. And if you are interested in learning more about that and volunteering, you can email me to get those details. We have some seed collection dates coming up. So I'll put my email in the chat box, and if you want to learn more, go ahead and shoot me an email and I'll send you more details. Give it about another minute if anyone has any questions they want to submit. Well, I have one question. I thought it was really interesting that that giving the seedlings more water didn't make a noticeable effect in their survival. Do you have any thoughts why that is? And is it different with other seedlings that are not sage?
Yeah, so I do, and that was something that was really surprising for us as well. We kind of went through all the hassle of finding this product and digging those huge holes to put them in, because we thought that that would be really important and would really improve our survival. I think it has to do with a couple of things. So, I mean, sagebrush is a pretty deep-rooted plant, which is how it survives in this really dry environment. It's able to pull water from kind of several layers of the soil. And so one of the ways that it can lose a lot of water is, through the air. So through, the wind and the sun and kind of all the other forces that are acting on it. So I think what we found is that the soil moisture is a little bit more steady as it gets a little bit deeper. And so sagebrush is really able to take advantage of that. And really with those small seedlings, protecting them from kind of the wind and sun exposure just seemed to be more important than giving them a little bit of extra water. And I mean, we have to be realistic. If we've been able to go out, with watering cans and give them lots of water, maybe that would have made a difference. But that's just not something that's really feasible in our area. Water's really heavy, and so moving it around is really difficult. And, most of the areas that we're talking about, there's not water readily available. So, I think we just found that protection and kind of reserving the moisture that the sagebrush already had was really more important than kind of the small amount of water that we're able to add.
Gotcha. All right, we have a couple other questions. The first one's from Lynn, and she's asking, do you see any impact, positive or negative, from flooding or debris flow that are fire related?
Sure. So, absolutely. That's one of our biggest concerns after fires, especially really large fires, is going to be the loss of soil and kind of the potential flooding after the fire. Because once you've taken that vegetation off, if there is a rain event, then that water is just going to move across that landscape and potentially move in really new ways. So we're always very concerned about kind of flooding. We're looking at the topography. Our hydrologist spends quite a bit of time looking at kind of the different streams, you know, washes that are there, and kind of trying to think about how we might protect those and armor those while we're trying to get that vegetation reestablished. So there's always that piece. From kind of a vegetation standpoint, which is more my, you know, more of my specialty, you know, the things that we worry about there are losing that seed bank, as I said, kind of earlier in the talk, also losing your top soil. So, you know, you have different soil horizons, and generally a lot of your nutrients and the things that are really important for plant growth are in that top part of the soil. And so when you lose that soil, whether it's to soil, you know, wind or water, then it becomes that much harder for your plants to establish.
All right. Next question is from Kathy. Regarding the treatments, were the mechanical and herbicides targeting invasives or all or any competing plants? Were invasives the main issue? Did you need to do multiple herbicide treatments?
Mm-hmm. So we were generally targeting non-native and invasive species. So in this area where we put our treatment areas, we were targeting areas that were dominated by cheatgrass, which is an annual invasive grass, or by crested wheatgrass, which is a non-native species. And it's one that we as managers historically have planted a lot of. So we put that out there, but it can be a really great competitor with a lot of our native grasses, and also with sagebrush as a seedling. Once sagebrush is established, the crested wheatgrass doesn't compete as much, but when you're trying to establish sagebrush, it has a really hard time when there's crested wheatgrass already established. So that's mostly what we were targeting with our herbicide treatments, and then also with our mechanical treatments. There were other species mixed in, you know, it wasn't an entire monoculture of those, but those were the ones that were dominating our treatment areas. And just for time, I didn't really get into that, but that's where we were on that. So multiple herbicide treatments, we did not do multiple herbicide treatments for this particular study. However, that is something that we have looked into and could potentially do. So, you know, cheatgrass is difficult because it can germinate really quickly with a fairly small amount of water, and it can germinate more than once over a season. So it can germinate and grow in the spring, and then it can do it again in the fall if there's enough moisture for it. So you do sometimes have to treat that more than once if you're really trying to knock back that competition. With crested wheatgrass, it's a really hardy perennial grass species, so it's a long-lived grass species, and you can rarely kill it with just one herbicide treatment. You know, there's some difficulties with that too. If you do have a remnant kind of native plant group in an area and you treat it multiple times with herbicide, you're also really going to knock those back. So it's always a little bit, you know, kind of like the seeding, you know, as managers, we really have to weigh, you know, kind of what are we trying to do here. And with the sagebrush specifically in this experiment, we were really just trying to knock things back a little bit to give that sagebrush a chance to get established, because our hope was once it was established, it could compete pretty well with what was there. So we weren't really trying to get rid per se of all of the vegetation that was there. We were just trying to knock it back enough to give that sagebrush a chance to get established.
You touched on this a little bit in that answer, but Susan is asking what type of non-native plants would be seeded. Are they ever planted as seedlings? Do you have anything else to say about that?
So we don't generally plant non-natives as seedlings. And as I said, in the national conservation areas, we no longer use non-natives in our seed mixes. But there are areas and times when we would use that. So for example, if you have an area that is really dominated by cheatgrass, then you might consider planting crested wheatgrass because it will hold the soil. It does provide forage for some of our species. You know, while it can compete with some of our natives, it doesn't tend to spread a lot. It tends to kind of stay where we plant it. So it's a little bit of a trade-off. If you're kind of looking at a cheatgrass scenario that's not going to provide forage, it's not going to do a great job holding the soil, and you're having a hard time getting natives established, then that might be an instance when you would choose to use a non-native. That's not something we're really doing in the conservation areas these days, but it is still used on public lands and generally are more degraded public lands.
All right, Sherry is asking, within the sagebrush islands, are you seeding with other seeds, grasses, forbs, etc., or sod seeds that have fallen to the ground previously and eventually germinate?
Okay, I'm not sure if I got the second part of that question, but the first part, so with this experiment, we did not put out seeds this time around. However, some of the work that we're continuing with Colorado State University, they'll be out, I think, next week. specifically looking at that and looking at that flowering plants piece. So with our seeds, we tend to have grass species and native grass species that do pretty well from seed, because we've been studying those for a long time, because they provide good forage for livestock and they provide good forage for big game. So we tend to know a lot about, or comparatively a lot about, our native grass and our native grass seed. We know less about our native shrubs and our native forums, which are our flowering plants. So we do have kind of part of that ongoing research is looking at that flowering piece specifically, and seeing how we might be able to reintroduce some of those to areas that they've been removed from, and if that works better in those kind of fertile islands. So stay tuned. We'll be working on that for the next couple of years. And then was there a second part to that question that I missed?
I think that covered it. Sherry, if you need follow-up, you can ask another question. And then Mike has a question. What are the differences between oak brush and sagebrush that makes oak brush a better regenerator? Yeah, and so there are a couple of things. Oak brush does tend to do better coming up from its roots. And I don't know specifically the mechanism for why that species does so much better than sagebrush. Sagebrush is also a pretty deep-rooted plant. It just doesn't resprout. It's just not part of its life history. So that's the first thing. If a fire doesn't burn hot enough to really burn through several layers of soil and really kill the root of oak brush, then that oak brush will resprout. Versus if a fire burns hot enough just to burn kind of the top part of the sagebrush, then that sagebrush will not resprout. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, if you think of the seed, so if you've ever seen the seed on an oak brush, it's like an acorn. It's a pretty hefty seed, versus the seed on a sagebrush. It's a really tiny, wispy little thing. So the oak brush seed is a lot hardier. It can survive in the seed bank for a lot longer. And it kind of that plant has more resources to get started than the sagebrush seed does. So the sagebrush really needs just the perfect, kind of mix of soil moisture, sun, not too hot, not too cold, for that seedling to get past that really vulnerable stage to a point where it's a little bit of a hardier plant. Whereas that oak brush, it kind of starts out with a lot more resources to help that seedling get past that stage. All right. Well, that looks like all the questions. Thanks for answering all those. And thank you for being here this evening. We do have one more 20th anniversary event coming up this Thursday. It's our Paleontology Hike with Rob Gay. He's our Land Programs Director and expert paleontologist. I believe there's only one spot left for that. So if you're interested, go ahead and sign up now. If you're interested in learning more about Colorado Canyons Association and our other events and how to get involved, you can visit our website, coloradocanyonsassociation.org. We host a lot of community events throughout the years, hikes, lectures, just fun stuff to connect the community more to the national conservation areas. So once again, thank you so much, Nikki, for being here. Yeah, if there are no more questions, we'll go ahead and end the meeting.
Well, thanks everyone for listening, and thanks CCA for putting this on.
All right, thanks, and have a good night, everyone.